So right off the bat, we are hosting this webinar just for the purpose of front loading a lot of the preparation processes for you as delegates attending the conference, but also for us to get into the flow of just the conference in general. And this is what we have planned for today. We're going to first talk a bit about the philosophy underlying the rules of procedure. Then we'll talk about the committee flow before actually delving into some of the rules of procedure. There are a lot of rules of procedure at NMUN, points or motions that we'll talk about. We can't cover them all, so it'll just be a select few. And then we'll talk about chair application, what that means, why this is important. And we'll have some time at the end for Q&A, but please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function in case you have any questions. We'll be monitoring both channels, so you have the opportunity to ask your questions whenever you feel like. And we'll make this interactive because it does feel boring to just keep on talking for an hour straight, and I want to make this as interactive as possible. So with that said, I think we can start with the philosophy. Why do we have rules of procedure? Well, rules of procedure are basically there to govern the proceedings at a model UN session. And at NMUN, we base our rules of procedure on the actual UN system, or the rules of procedure in the UN system. In the UN system, the rules of procedure are there to ensure sovereignty and equality of member states. Every member state has one vote, and that is reflected in rules of procedure. And the purpose of rules of procedure there are to facilitate a meaningful debate and decision-making within the various UN processes. Now, at NMUN, what we want to do is we want to be as realistic as possible. And obviously, that also means that we have to do some adaptation. One of the biggest ones is that at NMUN, the interpretation of the rules of procedure are at the discretion of the NMUN Secretariat. That means that we are basically your focal point if you have any questions on which rules, points, or motion to apply. But at the end of the day, you are obviously in the driver's seat, or you're the ones raising the motions and then calling for points or motions throughout. One thing I will want to mention is that at NMUN, we do not apply the Roberts Rules of Order. Things like points of personal privilege or points of information that you hear a lot, or yielding time back to the chair, that does not exist at NMUN. It doesn't exist at the UN either. Those rules come more from a parliamentary side of things, and that's not how the UN works. It's not what we want to do at NMUN either, so we don't apply that. If you have any questions, for instance, that's what the point of information usually is used for. Feel free to just ask those questions to the dais at conference. Now, the committee flow. This is important for you to understand when to use which motions, and we'll bring up a few motions here and there in this slide, but it's important to kind of set the scene first. Now, the committee flow at NMUN starts with a welcome and introduction. Every committee, right after the opening ceremony, will open with an opening speech by your dais, that is your director and assistant director. And after the opening speech that kind of set the scene, your dais will take the roll call, and the formal session will officially begin with the agenda setting phase. The agenda setting basically will determine which topic you're going to have discussed first, and for that purpose, you're going to have open up a speakers list that will be done by the dais. And once that speakers list is open and running, we'll do a switch between formal and informal debate. Suspensions of the meeting allow the committee to move between formal and informal debate. So formal debate is really just going through the speakers list, and informal debate is the working group discussions or just generally informal debates to discuss the agenda. At some point throughout that agenda setting phase, you will have one or two motions to set the agenda. And once one of those motions passes, you'll start with the first topic. Now, keep in mind that if a motion to set the agenda does not succeed in the first session, that is that Sunday session in the evening, right after the opening ceremony, if there is no motion that passed by the end of that session, the order will be automatically set in the way the topics are presented in the background guides. Now, once we have the first session started, we'll open up a new speakers list. So the speakers list that was there during the agenda setting phase will basically be discarded. And we'll have a new speakers list. And with that, we'll also have, again, this switch between formal and informal debate. And this is really where around 60% or 70% of the conference will take place. It's really that switch between formal and informal debate during your first topic. At some point throughout the conference, usually on the last day of the conference, your speakers list will exhaust, or somebody will raise a motion to close the debate, and that will trigger the voting procedure. Now, with the voting procedure, you'll need to have draft resolutions recognized by the dais. Your dais will explain more how that process works, but basically you'll submit your working papers throughout the first few days. They will be reviewed by the dais and then at some point be accepted as draft resolutions. In the voting procedure, you'll have a few points or motions that are available, but once the voting procedure is done, you'll move into the next topic. And then moving into the next topic will again mean opening up a new speakers list, switching between formal and informal debate, and maybe moving into another voting procedure. Once the topics are exhausted, or if you are at the very last session on Wednesday afternoon, you'll have at some point a motion to adjourn the meeting, and that is really the end of the conference. Now, what you see here are the rules of procedure in their short form. This is not an exhaustive list of all the rules of procedure that we entertain at NMUN. Those are contained in long form, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But everything you really need to know to have an effective and inclusive debate at NMUN is contained in this slide. You'll see that a few of them have an asterisk. Those are the ones that are only applicable during voting procedure, or they're not only applicable, like for instance, the point of order is applicable throughout, but those are the only ones that you can entertain during voting procedure. I want to focus on just a select few. Namely these few motions, mainly because they're the most common ones or the most complicated ones to cover. And I'm going to go through them in a reverse order. So we'll start with the adoption of the agenda. But first, I want to talk about the categories of votes, because that's also important to understand as it pertains to rules of procedure. At NMUN, we do have two categories of votes. The first, we have the substantive votes. Now, these substantive votes are votes on draft resolutions, amendments, and divided clauses, as well. This is only relevant for the Security Council, presidential, and press statements. We'll generally conduct those via electronic means. One thing to note is that observers and NGOs cannot vote on substantive matters. Their votes will not be counted towards the final tally up of the votes. And there's three types of votes. You can vote in favor, against, and abstain. If you abstain, your vote will not be counted towards the final result. For instance, if we have 100 member states, 11 vote in favor, 9 vote against, and 80 abstain, the draft resolution will still pass. That's kind of the mechanism of those substantive votes. Now for procedure votes, one thing I need to note is that if you indicate that you're present and voting during the roll call, you may not abstain. So you have to vote in favor or against. Now for the procedure votes, those are the votes on the motions, and they're conducted by raising placards. So there's generally no hub or electronic means being used. Observers and NGOs are allowed to vote on procedure matters, and no abstentions are possible. Yeah, that's basically the main difference between substantive votes and procedure votes. So procedure votes are votes on motions. Substantive votes are votes on draft resolutions. Now let's go through the first motion, the adoption of the agenda. And that's the motion you'll have in the first session to get through the agenda setting phase. This motion doesn't require a debate and only a simple majority to pass. And it's only passed really once per committee during the entire conference. And there's really only two options possible: topic 1 followed by topic 2, or topic 2 followed by topic 1. Those are the two options. The first option is the one that will be set by default if we don't have any motion to adopt the agenda pass at the end of the first session. Now, managing the committee flow can be done through setting the speaker's time. That's a motion that requires 2 speakers in favor, 2 speakers against. And those speeches should really only last 15 seconds. But one thing to note is that, or 2 things to note, is that it requires prior approval from the dais, meaning you cannot raise that motion before consulting the dais or informing the dais. They need to essentially approve this motion. And you cannot raise this during the first session. Preset speaker's time is 90 seconds for small committees, 60 seconds for large committees. So for the first session, for the agenda setting phase, you will have the speaker's time preset for you. If you want to change that at some point throughout the conference, you can raise that motion after consulting the dais. I've talked about this during voting procedure, but there's 2 ways generally to move into voting procedure. One is to close the debate. That motion ends all debate on a topic and moves directly into voting procedure. There's 2 speakers against, and it requires a 2/3 majority. So the hurdle here is pretty high for this to pass. But if it does pass, it usually means that everybody wants to move into voting procedure. The other option is to have the speakers list exhausted. Now, for that, you can motion to close the speakers list. You don't need to. You can also just let the speakers list run out without having anybody add themselves to the speakers list. But closing the speakers list ensures that it will run out eventually. There's no debate required. It requires a simple majority. And once that closed speakers list runs out, voting procedure starts. A motion to reopen the speakers list is possible, but usually when somebody closes the speakers list, it means that they want to go into voting procedure. One thing that is commonly, or that many delegates at the conference confuse, are the suspension and the adjournment. The suspension of the meeting basically means we'll just recess the meeting. We'll put a pause on the formal debate on the speakers list and just have time for ourselves, usually 60 minutes roundabout, to discuss within our working groups. And it's really the most commonly entertained motion at NMUN. The other motion is the adjournment of the meeting. That motion is only really used at the last session of NMUN because it ends the meeting. Now, one of those motions that are possible during voting procedure is the division of the proposal. The purpose of that motion is to create an annex to highlight specific clauses. That's also explained in a short form, but just to go through that, this motion is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 basically just asks the question, should we consider this motion? And thus, it's a procedure vote. It requires 2 speakers in favor, 2 speakers against, and then we'll move into procedure vote where everybody can vote really within the committee, even observers and NGOs. If that vote doesn't pass, committee moves to the next motion, nothing really happens. If the vote does pass, the clauses are divided out, and we'll move to part 2, which then asks the question, should we create an annex? Imagine it's basically like you have a draft resolution, that's a cake. The first part is, should we cut a slice of that cake? And the second part is, should we serve ourselves that cake? That's the basic idea of a division of the proposal. If the second part passes, that's a substantive vote. And again, here, you will not have NGOs or observers vote, and you have the option to vote against, in favor, or abstain. If that one does not pass, the clauses are discarded. So you decide basically to not serve yourself the cake. But if that vote does pass, you can reward yourself with clauses in an annex, and you'll have that cake to yourself. That's the basic flow of the division of the proposal. It's quite complex, but one thing I will note is to keep in mind the original purpose of the division of the proposal, which is to create an annex to add specific clauses. And the real UN, there are certain resolutions where you need to have an annex. For instance, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, Resolution 69/313. That resolution has an annex that is more or less created through the same process. Now I talked about the rules of procedure in the long form. You have a QR code here that you can just scan, but you can also just find it on the NMUN website. or just Google NMUN Rules of Procedure. The long form contains a detailed explanation of the rules of procedure that allows you to just go through this presentation basically as well. This basic presentation is based on this long form, and it explains the flow in more detail in some way, and also contains a script of a simulation to illustrate the rules of procedure in practice. So it's really useful to go through that. It's again kind of a treat, so to speak, because you'll also discover some motions that are not listed on the short form. Now we have one question from Ivan. The annex created if the motion passes and is voted in favor will be part of all draft resolutions, or just the one we're sponsors of? It's a good question. Let's quickly go back to the flow. So the division of the proposal only pertains to one draft resolution. I think we'll talk about the voting procedure flow in just a second, because then it'll be more clear. But the division of the proposal only pertains to one specific resolution, and one specific operative paragraph or operative clause. So it's not something that pertains to all draft resolution. It's really just something that will pertain to one specific draft resolution. It doesn't have to be the one that you're sponsor of. Really, any draft resolution can be divided out. But yeah, just again, have a look at the long form of the rules of procedure. It's really helpful. And yeah, especially the script. For me, when I first started out, the script was really helpful in kind of understanding the flow of a committee. We have another question from Osama. May you explain what two in favor and two against means here? I assume you mean a division of the proposal. Now, some motions require a debate that in practice are just about the question, should we consider this motion? Actually, let's go back to the short form. So there's certain motions that you see. There's a column that says debate. Certain motions require a debate to discuss whether or not we should entertain the motions. That's the adjournment of the debate. That's the closure of debate. It's the first part of the revision of proposal, the reconsideration of an issue once you've adjourned the debate, and the setting of the speaker's time. Now, debate in that sense requires you to speak for 15 seconds in favor of that motion, or if you want to speak against, for 15 seconds against. The way this works is that somebody raises one of those motions, and then the dais will say this motion requires debate. We'll have two speakers in favor, two speakers against, and then they'll ask for two speakers in favor. You raise your placard, and then two speakers against. You raise your placard, and then you'll move into the short debate on that motion. And then only then after the debate will you have the vote. I hope that answers your question on that one. One thing I also wanted to advertise here is the chair application. Now, what is a chair or a chairperson? In the real UN, a chairperson is basically the president of a committee. They're the ones guiding the committee throughout the processes. They preside over committee proceedings. They're the ones who entertain the motions, facilitate debate, etc. At NMUN, we do have a strong involvement of the secretariat, of the directors and assistant directors. So the chair actually has more of an assisting role at NMUN. They'll assist directors and assistant directors in committees with logistics and administrative tasks. But they'll obviously also preside over committee proceedings, take motions, facilitate votes, etc. I highly encourage you to apply as a chairperson, mainly because it's kind of a different role in the Model UN setting, because you'll be able to get a glimpse into what it's like to be on volunteer staff and kind of see the conference from a different light. you won't be able to hold speeches, but and be working in working groups on working papers, but you'll be able to facilitate the debate. You'll see a QR code with some more information. The deadline for application is 5th of March. Definitely speak to your head delegate or faculty advisor before you apply, though you need to have their blessings. And I only recommend doing that if you have a committee partner or if you are a floating head delegate, meaning you're not assigned a specific committee at conference, just to not put your dais partner into unnecessary disadvantage by basically leaving them alone. It does require your full attention throughout the conference, so it's something that you need to consider seriously, but it's highly encouraged. I personally have not chaired throughout my delegate years, but it would have been helpful for me to get a better understanding of staff before I eventually joined volunteer staff. With that, we are entering the Q&A phase, but I do think, well, first of all, keep asking your questions. But one thing I also want to promote are our other Model UN or NMUN conferences. I don't know, Dan, if you want to quickly talk about those.
Yeah, sure. So, as well as NMUN New York, NMUN also offers a number of the other conferences, the other North American conference. We have NMUN DC, which takes place every year in the November time. So the registration for that is going to open on the 15th of April, 2025. The Secretary General for that conference, Leah Edwards, will actually be present herself at week A of our conference this year. She's one of our senior staffers. So I'm sure if you of your delegation have any questions about NMUN New or NMUN Canada, she'd be more than happy to answer them for you as well. We also have NMUN Canada 2025, which is the international conference that's happening this year. So that's taking place in November also. So very close to the DC conference. And the Secretary General for that is Ashley Rollheiser. And Ashley will also be present at week A of NMUN NY 2025. So I'm sure she'd be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Both of their emails are listed in this presentation, and I know they're more than happy for you to drop an email if you have any questions about the conference itself, be it the logistics, registration, what committees, etc. they'll be simulating. They'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you. I believe we have a question. The question is, are there any tolerable percentages of AI and plagiarism at NMUN? I suppose from the outset, I'll just give a brief answer and allow Martin, because he's the substantive officer for the conference, to also chip in. NMUN has a strict plagiarism policy in terms of plagiarism is not allowed at NMUN. It's an academic conference, and similar to a lot of the universities that you attend as well. So there's a strict no plagiarism. There's also a strict of no bringing pre-prepared materials to conference, so pre-prepared draft resolutions or working papers, etc. All of the work that you will conduct at the conference is to take place within the conference space itself. We don't have a specific AI policy per se, as I know a lot of universities do not, but I might I know Mart has looked at this, so I might let Mart jump in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of AI, there's two points here to note. One is AI, Gen AI specifically, so ChatGPT, Gemini, Meta AI, etc. I highly recommend you do not use them at NMUN. Because you're there to learn about how to write resolutions, about how to be a diplomat and learn the diplomatic language, and you can't learn that if you just have that generated by AI. B, and that's kind of the other point to it. I do recognize that it's some some non-native speakers of English might want to have Grammarly, for instance, to help them, refine language, etc. I think that's one of those instances where it's more or less acceptable, but please take into consideration that we will check position papers, for instance, against plagiarism. And for working papers, you want to be inclusive and make sure that you don't just copy things, but rather from a chatbot or something, but rather have everybody contribute to the phrasing of language. So yeah, we have a strict plagiarism policy, and AI falls under plagiarism. And for plagiarism itself, again, there's kind of a nuance there. No, we don't. We're very strict against plagiarism, but within the UN, there's this concept called agreed language. Agreed language basically means that there are certain phrases, certain operative clauses that always pop up in a resolution because they are agreed by everybody. So there's no incentive to change or add new language. It's a bit complicated, but for you at NMUN, it doesn't really mean much. You can use that as inspiration, but that wouldn't necessarily fall under plagiarism. There's another two questions. One anonymous question: can you recommend sites to check AI and plagiarism? There's a few online. We can't make any recommendations. We have our internal tool, but we can't disclose that. The second question is, how much time can a suspension of the meeting for internal discussion last? And that one is by Paul. It depends. It depends on what the dice wants, what's good for the committee flow. Usually during the main part of the conference, it should be around 1 hour. Sometimes you can, recess for 70, 80, maybe 90 minutes, but 90 minutes is really the maximum. There's sometimes you might have shorter suspensions. Like for instance, during the agenda setting, you might only go for 20-minute suspensions, 30-minute, etc. So it depends on the flow. There's no absolute maximum, but 2 hour suspensions, for instance, that's not what we want, because you can't just spend your entire conference time in a suspension without having listened to any speeches. The speeches are important to get an understanding of what other working groups are working on. A good question.
Just to also add to further points to what Martin was said, the both aspects of the conference are as important. So formal and informal debate are as important as each other. So we as a dais love to see the speeches that you prepared. It's also a really good opportunity, especially in the plenary committees, when you won't get an opportunity to speak to each of the delegations, to maybe speak of some of the ideas that you have, how your delegation wish to address the issue. So you can speak to a larger audience at one specific time. The other aspect is, don't fear if you do request, say, a 2 hour suspension. We always, as the dais, try facilitate a motion. So the dais may prompt you to say, at this time, we're just facilitating suspensions for a maximum of 45 minutes to ensure the flow of committee. Do you wish to amend or withdraw your motion? So you'll be given an opportunity by the dais to say, amend your motion to 45 minutes, to which you can, and then the dais will then entertain that motion. So don't hesitate to put your time forward, but the dais will know what's best for facilitating the flow of committee and just may wish for you to amend or withdraw your motion. And that goes to say, like, the dais, in terms of putting motions forward, are always on your side. So don't get too nervous about putting a motion forward at conference. We'll always try to facilitate that and get to exactly what you want. I know as a delegate myself, I may have put forward motions to adjourn the meeting when I went to suspend the meeting, and the dais would have facilitated that by just asking me to amend my motion and then explaining the purpose of amending my motion. Are there any other questions that anyone has? Yeah. Can you give some examples of when a proposal will be divided? What impact would a successful division of the proposal have? I can briefly answer. So it's up to, I suppose, the people who've drafted the draft resolution. The purpose of a division of the proposal is to highlight a specific aspect of the draft resolution. So maybe it's a program you wish to implement or something that you really want to highlight as a core aspect of the draft resolution. So that may be something you would consider dividing. You can only divide out operative clauses and not preambular clauses as well. So it'll just focus on the operative, the doing parts of the draft resolution. And the impact of a successful division of the proposal is that you would have the draft resolution, which then becomes a resolution, and then an annex, which would also attach to that draft resolution. So it would appear as an annex just after it. I don't know if there's anything, Mart, you want to add.
No, no, it's that's precisely it. Another question by Paul. We and we automatically start the day with internal discussion before the meeting, right? Let me go back to that slide. Just to get that flow right. So the first session will start with a formal session. Formal session, not just speakers list, obviously. It's also just asking for motions, etc. So you actually start with the formal session with an internal discussion, and before that, we'll have the opening ceremony. So it's opening ceremony, welcome and introduction. Then your committee starts, the formal session begins, and until there is a suspension of the meeting, you will basically be in that formal part of the committee. There's another question by an anonymous viewer. How advisable is it to change the speaking time up to 90 seconds in larger committees? That depends. There's no right or wrong answer here. It depends really on what is good for the committee flow. In most cases, I would not advise you to do that, mainly because larger committees have a lot of people on the speakers list and everybody wants to have their voice heard, and you should strive to have everybody give their voice on a certain topic. So really consider what the advantage of that motion to set the speaker's time to 90 seconds in larger committees would be. Yeah, just make sure that you outline the advantage, because in most cases those 60 seconds are already sufficient to have many speakers, as many speakers as possible in a plenary sized or larger sized committee. So be mindful of that. But again, there's no strict rule here. It depends on what the dais recognizes as important for the committee flow.
Yeah, and just to add on to what Martin said there, a motion to change the speaker's time isn't entertained at the first session of NMUN. And the other item is that if you wish to put a motion forward to change the speaker's time, you should approach the dais first just to have a discussion. And say if you request 90 seconds for a plenary, maybe they'll say we're not in favor of that because we want to facilitate a good flow of speeches, and we're a plenary committee. We have a speakers list of over 100. We want to make sure as many voices are heard as possible. So they'll really have a discussion with you. But yeah, just to also flag that again, as Martin has on the screen there, and it also is a 2 speakers in favor and 2 speakers against. So those 15-second speeches will come in for this one as well.
Also keep in mind that other people might feel strongly about that, especially if there's someone on the speakers list further down. They might not want to do that either. So you'll automatically have people voting against that. If you really want to set the speaker's time or change the speaker's time, try to lobby within your committee as well to get a feeling of whether or not that motion is actually possible. You do have to advocate for votes in the end, so keep that in mind too.
Perfect. We've had a question from Paul. I've often seen in committees where many resolution drafts are submitted. We spend a lot of time on the first one and then rush all the others. What way could we have to avoid that? Is there a maximum number of resolution drafts that can be submitted? There is no maximum number of resolution drafts that can be submitted to the dais. We, as I suppose, the leadership team for NMUN, as well as the Under Secretary Generals for that department and the dais themselves, the director and assistant director you have, will always monitor the number of, I suppose, draft resolutions, in the sense that we want to ensure that you're entering voting procedure in an adequate time to ensure that each of those draft resolutions can have adequate time to have potentially any amendments, friendly or unfriendly, dealt with, if there's a division of the proposal to be put forward, or any other items. So I suppose the mechanism that we have internally in place is we'll always monitor the flow of all of our committees, and respond accordingly to see if we need to speak to the committee as a whole, to see how we can best ensure that everyone has adequate time to deal with all of their draft resolutions. I don't know if you have another further point there, Mart.
There is one explanation for why that might happen, that you spend a lot of time on the first one and then rush through the others. Keep in mind that a lot of people that attend NMUN often attend the conference for the very first time, so they might not be too familiar with the actual proceedings of the voting procedure. You basically have a lot of people that are new to the conference, experience at least one draft resolution in its full, proceeding. So it's something that happens a lot, is where you have to explain delegates, okay, this is now what this means. I have a flow of the voting procedure here, and it might be helpful to go through that for others, for those of you that are new to the conference. And the voting procedure, after the speakers list has been exhausted, or the debate has been closed, usually starts with an explanation of the rules of procedure by the dais. Again, those four motions with that asterisk. Then they'll move into electronic voting, or explaining how electronic voting works, and emphasize consensus at NMUN. And then they'll start with the first draft resolution. They'll introduce the first draft resolution. They'll announce all the amendments, and then go through the amendments first, explain what friendly amendments are, then puts them in the friendly amendments. Unfriendly amendments are then voted upon with a debate. Oh yeah, and they require debate and the substantive vote. Then they'll ask, is there a request for a recorded vote or any other points of motions? And the reason why it might take so long during the first draft resolution is because you have to explain each step with to those new delegates, and then after the second draft resolution, it might go quicker. After the first vote, you just go back to the same process again. And once you've done this one time, it'll be a lot easier and quicker to do it, and then we can take up speed as well, to go through the draft resolution. So there's an explanation for that. It also just depends on how many amendments there are on a draft resolution, how many motions are being raised, how many divisions of the proposal are happening. It depends on a variety of factors. But just to mention that there's usually an explanation for why one draft resolution might take longer versus another, etc. As we wait for other questions, we have 10 minutes left on this webinar. Maybe one thing to note is how to go from a working paper to a resolution. Working papers, they are those documents that are elaborated in working groups as informal documents. They're not official documents of the committee, and as such, they can be referenced, for instance, in speeches, but you can obviously always speak to contents that are being discussed in certain working groups, and then highlight those in your speeches. That's what speeches are ultimately for. And these working papers are reviewed by the Secretariat through various iterations, usually one or two, and before being accepted as draft resolutions. Once they are draft resolutions, they're circulated throughout the entire committee, so everybody will have access to the draft resolution. And then you'll have time for amendments to submit to any draft resolution that you wish. And then at some point, you'll go through voting procedure, and the voting procedure transforms the draft resolution to the actual resolution. That's kind of the cycle. Well, it's not really a cycle. It's a process for going from working papers to resolutions. And there's a question that pertains to that. What determines what draft resolution becomes debated first? That really depends on which working paper is submitted first and reviewed by the Secretariat to be considered as a draft resolution. It depends on the dais, really, saying, okay, this working paper ticks all the boxes for what we want for this topic, for this committee. the working group addressed all the concerns, then we'll accept it as a draft resolution. Those reviews are usually they can be comprehensive if the working paper is quite long, but we usually aim to return fairly quickly with a quick turnaround just for some high-level remarks to ensure that the working paper addresses the committee, the topic, and is just relevant to the committee or is within the mandate of the committee. But there's no specific order per se of which draft resolution gets put forward first. It's really a first come, first serve, or rather a first to be submitted and then to be submitted in a manner that satisfies all the needs for the secretariat, for the committee secretariat, to be accepted as a draft resolution. And usually what happens is that we'll have a few draft resolutions submitted. So we don't necessarily want this to be a race for submitting the first draft resolution or having the first draft resolution submitted and accepted. It's about facilitating meaningful debate, having all the various views and insights by delegates considered before going into voting procedure. So we don't want you to just submit. We don't want this to be a race of who can submit the quickest draft resolution and then go immediately in the voting procedure. We'll have some debate as well on the draft resolution, because at the end of the day, if you submit a draft resolution, you also need to make sure that you have enough votes for your draft resolution. So being the first one will allow you to socialize the draft resolution and garner votes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your draft resolution will get voted on during voting procedure. So keep that in mind as well.
It also, just to add to what Martin was saying and going back to our previous discussion on, it doesn't matter if it's submitted first and accepted first. It just naturally, the first draft resolution will receive that part A of the speech where we take delegates slowly through the voting procedure, just so everyone is aware of the different phases of voting procedure. But that second half of Martin's slide, once the dais says we'll now move on to consider draft resolution 1-1. It'll consider friendly and unfriendly amendments, and then it will move on to say, is there a request for a recorded vote or any other motions? And you'll still have the opportunity to bring forward a division of the proposal during that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get to, if you're first, you'll get more time spent on your draft resolution. It just means that you'll just get that maybe part A of that speech dealt with that draft resolution 1-1, but draft resolution 1-2, 1-3 will still get the same time consideration in terms of motions and stuff that can be raised for it. Are there any other points or questions? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either. I think we'll keep talking for the next 5 minutes because we have 4 minutes because we still have some time left. So I'm gonna keep on the chair application page on there just so that you have the QR code in case you want to scan it again. Again, just have a look at it. Do consider it if you have the capability to do so, to apply for chair. It's an interesting experience. And something that I would have benefited from as a delegate. But I don't know, Danny, where were you a chair?
Yeah, I was actually a chap. So this taking you back shows my age at NMUN. So we used to have chair and rapporteurs. And for smaller committees, that was a combined role of essentially a chap. So we just do chair applications now. But yeah, I was a chair of UNICEF for my first year. So I was a delegate first, then I was a head delegate the second year, and then I was chair or chap of UNICEF. Really, really good experience. It was a really good insight into the other side of the dais, and you learn a lot about, I suppose, the flow of committee from the perspective of the dais. You also get a really good chance to chair. So during the going in and out, bringing the flow of the committee from formal to informal sessions. And then also usually the chair will do maybe one voting procedure, depending on the flow of the committee. They'll do voting on maybe 1 or 2 draft resolutions if time allows. But it's a really good perspective of, I suppose, the administrative side of accepting the working papers, tracking sponsors and signatories, accepting friendly and unfriendly amendments, basically what happens behind the dais that you wouldn't necessarily consider as your delegate. So I'd highly recommend. And it was a good segue then of I was like, I really love this. And then that's why I decided to apply to be a volunteer staffer for NMUN. And here Martin and I are now. So definitely recommend. But do have a conversation first with either your head delegate or faculty advisor or whoever the person in charge of, I suppose, your delegation going to New York. If it's not specifically those positions, have a conversation with them. Have a conversation with your dais partner if you're going to be leaving a committee partner if you're going to be leaving a committee partner by themselves. Too. And just to make sure that they're confident that they'll be able to continue on in the committee without you. But definitely a really good experience for sure. We have a question.
We
Um,
have two more
yeah.
questions.
So a last question from Paul is, since the committees will be constituted by many members, do you advise to try and make the best coalition straight away or start with a few allies to write the draft and then gather people before the debate? Um, how you wish to constitute your working paper group or your formation or your working group alliance is completely up to you. The only thing that we, I suppose, really promote at NMUN is just that it's an inclusive experience for absolutely everyone in the conference, so that maybe if someone approaches you and they have some ideas, just be open to hearing, to challenging yourself and challenging your perspectives and your ideas. And just because you are um, even a sponsor on a paper, or like you don't necessarily have to agree with absolutely every single point within the paper. And a signatory, it just means that you wish to put a paper up for debate as well. So there's no harm in becoming a signatory of a paper that you don't necessarily agree with all of the different points on. And on that point, when it becomes a draft resolution and then a resolution, the sponsors and signatories are removed and it becomes a work of the body as well. So we don't have it's however you wish to organize. I suppose you could maybe split it up into smaller groupings in terms of logistics for space, but just ensure that the whole process remains as inclusive as possible. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Martin.
No, exactly. Like the strategy is totally up to you.
Yeah,
Whatever works best for you.
yeah.
There's another question about how would you describe the sharing experience in NMUN and how does it differ from to previous sharing experiences in your opinion? I think generally the experience at NMUN is a lot more comprehensive. We're one of the NMUN conferences that are moderating conferences that just are the longest, the most intense in that regard too. So you'll have new exposure to a longer time of being chair or more intense committee sessions. So I think in that sense, it's also more realistic and also just much more valuable in that regards. It's also one thing that I will note is that it is bigger too, especially if you chair in a plenary sized committee, you'll have around 300, 350 people looking up to you, which can be scary at first, but you'll quickly get used to being in front of 300 350 people, and it also not necessarily chairing but being on a dais helped me kind of get over that fear of public speaking. So it's also helpful in that regard. I don't know, Danny, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, it's super helpful. And just to flag as well, we will still be doing the rules of procedure, general rules of procedure, Q&A session or training or Q&A session that we do at conference for week A and week B. And if you are successful and do become a chair, we do a chair training session. So you specifically come together with your dais partners and the various chairs and dais partners from the other committees. And we break off into smaller groups and we do small simulations and stuff. So the first time you chair, I suppose the two most important things to know are you will not be expected to go in on the first night and chair a session. The dais will generally do the opening speech and do the first couple of, maybe depends on them, but maybe even the whole first session of chairing. So you can maybe watch and observe them and get an idea of what their mannerisms and how they chair is. And the second thing is the first time you chair or have an experience of chairing will not be within the committee sessions. We run simulations simulations beforehand within training. So you'll get an opportunity to kind of like learn the language, get comfortable with moving in and out of formal and informal session within those simulations that we do prior to the conference actually beginning. So you do get another training session before then, and your DIAS partners as well act as mentors all throughout the process. If you're week B, Martin and I will be floating around. We're always happy to offer morale and support and answer any questions, and likewise for week A as well. But it is definitely a lengthier chair experience, so I think that's really good. It's a more intensive experience as well, but it's a well supported experience, and you do get really good mentoring as well throughout the process. And I think that wraps us up. Our inboxes are always open should you have any questions in relation to the chair applications themselves, or if you have any questions in relation to general items such as submission of position papers or just anything about the rules of procedure. As I said, we will also run the Q&A session at both week A and week B, and successful chair applicants will also receive training as well. A big thank you from myself and from Martin for joining the session with us here today. And I speak, I suppose, on behalf of the whole leadership team of the 2025 conference that we're super excited to welcome you to New York in April. It's crazy to think how soon it's catching up with us now.
Yeah, no, just to reiterate, also thank you to everybody who asked those interesting questions. I think that was very helpful in kind of, um, guiding our conversation or our presentation too. And yeah, I'm also looking forward to seeing you all in New York in just, it's, yeah, less than 2 months now.
Oh my
So
goodness.
it's coming up. All right.
Perfect. Well, happy
Have a good
Saturday,
one.
everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye bye.